Hey guys, so today I want to talk about key clicks for composers. I made the Contemporary Techniques 101 video probably over a year ago now. It was one of my first ones, and I will link that in the description and the cards as well. But I want to talk about it in terms of writing for it and those fun things that we always have to talk about in these videos. So key clicks seem like a pretty easy thing to write for. They're pretty straightforward in terms of technique, and they're a pretty established technique, having been written in things like Varese in 1921 or whatever it was. So it's not exactly a new thing, but it is something that I always see kind of messed up, or at least not written in the best way or the most effective way, and that's why we're talking about that. So the first thing is the speed. There's a physical action that has to happen to make the key click. It's more than just putting down your finger or lifting up your finger. In fact, lifting up your finger will not make that sound. So if you're writing an ascending passage, there's an extra action that has to be added because you have to add a downward stroke while you're also lifting up keys. For the most part, that's true. There are a couple notes on flute where like you can key click while ascending, but quite honestly, it's so hard to figure that out, and there's really no reason for composers to know that much about flute that I just recommend you think very carefully about the speed that you're writing things, especially with ascending key clicks. Descending ones are still going to be slower than a typical flute player can play normal pitches, because you still do have to have the very extended, very hard action on the keys, and that's going to take a little bit more time. It's going to be faster than ascending, obviously, because you're not adding an extra, you're just increasing the action of putting the fingers on the keys, but it's still something that takes a little bit more time because there's more energy exerted. And that also changes based on whether you're playing a pitch or you're just key clicking. If you're playing pitches, things are gonna be a little harder because you have to coordinate the key click and the note change and whatever articulation you're using. There are a lot of variables happening when you're key clicking and playing and trying to get all of this together. So I would just recommend you thinking or talking to a flutist about whether it's possible. And if you don't have access to a flutist, just thinking carefully about kind of this kind of action, like how fast can you do that, and then add a little bit more facility, just because professional flutists tend to have a little bit more than the amateur ones. Obviously, we've been practicing it for a very long time, but it's still not something that we can do as fast as everything else. I think that's the biggest thing with contemporary techniques, is they are slower. They just have to be, because we're doing things that aren't necessarily natural to the instrument. They're obviously in the instrument and there's sounds that are possible, but it's not exactly how the instrument was designed to be played. The next thing is obviously dynamic. I think in the Contemporary Techniques 101 video, I talk a lot about how there really aren't that many dynamic opportunities with key clicks. There are ones that are louder, there are ones that are softer, and you can get a little bit of dynamic range depending on which key you clicked, but it's still not going to be the huge dynamic range that the flute has. And I know that the flute does not have as big of a dynamic range as some other instruments, but like in comparison to key clicks, it's gigantic. It's really just kind of assume it's one dynamic, and if you get something louder, you can always adjust, or you can like it and keep going with it. But it's really best to assume that they're not going to be that loud. I really would say like mezzo forte to mezzo piano is the best range to assume they're going to be in. And also remember that if you're playing with them, the flute is going to overpower the click to an extent. So you'll get that percussive start, but you might not get as much of the true key clicks as you would if they were just clicks. The other thing is, think about the flutist's technical facility in terms of like repetitive motion. Tendinitis, carpal tunnel, focal dystonia, these are all really, really big issues in flute because of the way the flute is built and the way that the flute is played. We're completely asymmetrical, and it puts the weight onto different places that it really shouldn't be. And so asking us to have repetitive key clicks can be damaging to an extent. It can be a problem if you're asking us to click certain weak fingers, or you're not giving us enough rest, or it just certain things are hard. So it's thinking about how repetitive something is, how much you're asking us to do, especially if it's the same note over and over again, is something that is really appreciated. Obviously, if you're repeating the same note, there's opportunities to alternate which keys you're clicking within the same fingering, but it's still something that can be really, really wearing if it's for the entirety of a piece, or even just for like a long extended section of a piece. So especially if it's in a texture that's very, very loud, it's not always worth it to have us do that, and it can be damaging to have us do that. So it's hard to justify doing it in a piece when I feel like I'm going to get hurt and I'm not even being heard. And the final thing that I want to talk about with key clicks is, of course, range. I think the biggest thing that I find with contemporary techniques in general, and mistakes I see in compositions, is that composers don't realize that some of the percussive techniques have a limited range in comparison to the flute. Well, yes, I can play whatever note you want me to, and I can click whatever key you want me to. It's not always going to have the desired effect. It might not sound in the range that you want it to, and it also might disrupt the flute sound depending on what note you're asking us to click. I personally prefer that composers let me pick which key to click and just give me a note to create. Whether it's just I have a note with a key click and I have to play that note and click at the same time, or it's a straight click and you want me to produce whatever note that is, I prefer having the ability to choose, just because I know my instrument better than you do. I know what's going to be easier in the context of whatever is happening around it, and also I can prevent more injury because I know my body. So there's that to be reckoned with, and there's also the fact that key clicks kind of sound in the same octave no matter what octave you write them in. Physics of the flute, it's always going to sound in the first octave. It's just kind of how it works. You can't really get high key clicks because it's all about the resonance of the flute, and because the flute is based on the harmonic series, it's going to go down to the bottom of the harmonic series. It's just how it works. Again, because the high octave fingerings are so altered from the bass harmonic, you can sometimes get some high ones, but they're going to be quiet and they're not going to be very resonant or worthwhile, in my opinion at least. So it's definitely something to remember, that key clicks have an octave. They have a single octave. And while yes, you can obviously put a key click on a high F and it will have a key click, it won't necessarily be a high F key click. It will just be a sound that's related to that, and then I'll play a high F. I think the best thing is, if you're writing key clicks with pitch, just write a click and write the note you want and let the flutist figure it out. And if you want them with pitch, keep them in the first octave, because that's all they're gonna be. If you like this video, please give it a like. If you're new here, subscribe. If you want to support me more, check out my Patreon, and I'll see you guys next week.